I'm Kay Going, and I'm an author of books for children and teens, and I've been writing for about 10 years. I have multiple books out. I have a picture book, I've got a couple middle grade novels, a couple YA novels, and a how-to book for adults called Writing and Selling the YA Novel. I have to say I had an idyllic childhood. I really did. I grew up in the Hudson Valley area, and most of my life I lived on what is the Borden estate. And if you're familiar with Borden's ice cream, this was what Mr. Borden, where he had lived, and he had his big mansion on the hill, and he had his barn where he kept the dairy cows, and there was a greenhouse and a dance hall. Beautiful estate, it still is. And they had made the dance hall into 2 apartments. So I was in half of the building that had been the dance hall. And it was a very small apartment. My family wasn't rich, it wasn't like a wealthy area. But in terms of the imagination of a child, what a perfect place to grow up. So I had this beautiful place to grow up, and I'm the daughter of a librarian. My mother's a librarian who primarily works with children, and then my dad's a biologist. So I had this sort of melding of reading and a love of reading, and then also a love of the outdoors and the natural world. And one of the things that my family did when I think about my childhood and how it kind of prepared me to be a writer is we read out loud together, all of us as a family, from the time that I was a little kid up until I was embarrassingly old. Actually, okay, I'm going to admit it on camera, high school, we were still reading aloud together, and we just read so many amazing classic novels. We read The Hobbit when I was probably 4 or 5. We read all of Lloyd Alexander and Susan Cooper's Dark is Rising series and The Island of the Blue Dolphins. These became the books that absolutely shaped who I am as a writer, and they shaped my imagination. So when I look back at what kind of childhood I have, I think that I was being prepared to be a writer long before I had any idea that that was what my profession would be. I have a hard time figuring out where to start when talking about where did my career actually begin. I guess the easiest place to start when talking about my earlier career would be when I got hired at Curtis Brown Limited. And Curtis Brown is one of the oldest literary agencies in Manhattan, and it's a wonderful, wonderful place. I am still represented by them today. And what happened was, how I got the job there was my dad had one employee. He runs a little environmental business, and he hired a young geologist who was my age. And because he works in home, this young geologist, Andrew Taylor, would sit at our kitchen table, and of course we got to know each other very well and good friends, and because he was in our house all the time. So anyway, he knew that I liked to write. And he said one day, why don't you come and talk to my dad? My dad is a literary agent at Curtis Brown Limited, Clyde Taylor. And the way that things worked at Curtis Brown is it's a hierarchy situation where you start at I started at the switchboard. And then you have a mentor agent, I had 2. And they give you manuscripts to read and to do readers' reports on, and while you're also, of course, answering the phone. So while I was probably at the switchboard for about 6 months, and while I was there, I read romance novels, I read spy novels, I read things for the film department, I read literary fiction, I read children's books. It was great. It was a great experience. And not only was I reading all of these things, but I was also writing these reports where the reader's reports are 2 to 3 pages generally. a brief plot synopsis and then the pros and cons in terms of what might make this worth taking on or not worth taking on. And so I'm also getting the skills to write these reports and getting better and better at that. And so then what happens is when you've gotten to a certain point and there's an opening, you get to move to being an agent's assistant. So I moved from the switchboard to assisting Laura Blake Peterson and Ginger Knowlton. And both wonderful ladies, I adore them, and they were such wonderful mentors to me. So you have this wonderful mix of being mentored and reading a ton and figuring out what works and what doesn't work in a manuscript. And at the same time, I was still writing sort of as a hobby. But also at this point starting to think for the first time, I think maybe I could do this. Most people ask about my first novel, and the first novel that I wrote did not sell. It was a book called Colors, and it was about a gay straight student alliance group that started in Middle America. And one of the things that I had done with that book was I really wanted it to seem like these kids could be anybody, this town could be anywhere. And so I went a little overboard, I think, in terms of trying to make everything seem average. And who wants to read about average? So I got a wonderful rejection letter back. And that seems like an oxymoron, wonderful rejection letter, but in this case it really was. And the line that stuck with me, the editor said that sometimes characters need to be larger than life. And that piece of advice was so transformative. It clicked with me in a way that I instantly understood. And I thought, all right, this is what I'm going to do. And so my next book was Fat Kid Rules the World. And I made this character who is both physically and mentally just a larger-than-life type of character. Fat Kid Rules the World is the story of Troy Billings, and he is a larger-than-life character. He's 6 foot, 296 pounds, but more than just his physical presence, Troy has a mental presence in terms of how he thinks, and he tends to think in headlines, and he has all of these images that kind of come into his mind. And so he's a very quirky character, and he has a quirky inner life. And the book begins with him trying to decide if he's going to kill himself, and he's rescued by Kurt McRae. And Kurt McRae is a prodigy guitar genius, and everybody knows about him. And but he's also this kind of semi-homeless, hard luck kid. And so the two of them become this dynamic duo of the story. So the story is about how these two characters forge a friendship and how they sort of discover the true meaning of punk rock and what it means to be musicians. And it's definitely a story that's had a lot of success. It was my first published novel, and it won a Prince honor, and that sort of started a string of success for Fat Kid. Fat Kid has come out in many other countries: Japan, Korea, UK, trying to think of all the different covers. I love when my books come out in other countries because I love seeing all the different covers and thinking of the books traveling places where I haven't even traveled yet is so exciting. So Fat Kid's had a lot of foreign editions, had the audio edition, and of course the film is really exciting. Liberation of Gabriel King is a story about two kids who decide to overcome all their fears in the course of one summer. And it takes place down in Georgia in the summer of 1976. And I modeled the town that it takes place in after the town where Jimmy Carter grew up. So I modeled it after Plains, Georgia. So the idea is these two kids, Gabe is a bit of a chicken, and he decides that he does not want to go to the 5th grade because when you go to the 5th grade, there's going to be these bullies that he's going to have to deal with. And so he says, I'm just going to stay back and I'm never going to go ahead in school. And his best friend is Frida Wilson, and she says, of course, that he needs to have some liberating. And Frida is the only African-American kid in their class, and she is the daughter of a preacher who is also kind of a socially progressive parents, and so she has all these big ideas about social justice. And so the book is really a combination of telling a story that can be funny about Gabe trying to overcome all of these fears. And in fact, in the back of the book, there's a fear list with, I don't remember how many, but it's just a ton of fears. And they're all things like, he's scared of getting flushed down the toilet, and calling a teacher mama by mistake, and cows getting loose. And so there's the humor of it, but then the underlying story is about trying to find your courage. And of course, Frida represents the flip side of that, in that she has really real fears, and of course in that time period in dealing with prejudice. And so you've got the two kids and the dealing with fears. One of my favorite things about the liberation of Gabriel King is that kids send me their fear lists. How amazing is that, to receive those? Oh my gosh. I love the fact that it inspires kids to think about fear, which is something none of us really get to do very often, and certainly I don't think we give children enough opportunities to do that. So receiving those fear lists is just, every single time, I feel completely blessed. Saint Iggy is the story of Iggy Corso, and he gets kicked out of school in the very beginning of the book. And Iggy has a really hard life. In a lot of ways, it's a bit of a dark book. He is living in the projects, and he has a deadbeat dad, and his mom is missing. There's a lot about drug addiction, which makes it sound like a really depressing book, but it's not. It's actually more comical, but it's a little bit of a dark comedy. But Iggy gets kicked out of school, and he decides that he really wants to do something great with his life, despite all of his disadvantages and what's happened. But he just has no idea how to go about doing this. And so the story itself is, it's meant to make the reader question. There are definitions of good and bad, and why do we think some things are good and some things are bad, and the black and white kind of definitions that we tend to apply to things. So Iggy is a character who does all of the right things for the wrong reasons and all of the wrong things for the right reasons. And so it's this constant kind of questioning. And he's a character who is a bit naive, but he's also incredibly worldly in the sense. So it's a lot of contrasts in the book. So the story takes him on his quest to do something good with his life and how he ultimately decides to do that. And it leaves the reader questioning whether that ultimate choice was in fact a good thing or not. So the story is about a girl who has lost her mother, and she goes with her dad, and they have moved to an area that has an overgrown apple orchard that is rumored to be haunted, and their house is on the edge of a graveyard, and she meets a boy who claims to be a ghost. And so there's all these kinds of elements of play, only now they're just in a different environment. And so on her 11th birthday, she's given an apple seed, which is a magical apple seed, and it takes her to this alternative version of the area where she lives. And so the story has a lot of fantasy, and it's a lot about the girl learning to deal with the grief that she feels for the loss of her mother. And again, it's a lot of my books deal with the interplay of light and darkness, and so the themes are heavy, but in order to make them work for children, I always try to add a lot of humor or a lot of adventure in this case. So it's also a bit of an adventure story. King of the Scrubs is just total fun. It's a story that has a lot to do with glam rock, and it has to do with a character who is just this drop-dead gorgeous son of a supermodel, and it's a reversal of the classic story where the nerd wants to become popular. And in this case, the popular kid wants to become a nerd because he wants to please his demanding father. And so he decides that he's going to set out on this quest to, become this classic nerd. Only it's a lot harder than he thinks because he is drop-dead gorgeous, and so, the girls are attracted to him, and as much as he tries to dress bad and, and do all the stereotypical things that he thinks are going to, lead him into nerddom, it doesn't work for him. And so there's just so much humor in the book, which made it a lot of fun to write. It's also a story where Liam gets kicked out of his house and he goes to live with his uncle, who is a cross-dressing, flamboyantly gay DJ who works for this glam rock station, and he has these 3 friends, the uncle does, that are just, each one of them is really quirky, and these 4 incredibly quirky characters kind of combine to give Liam this dad figure in his life that he's never had. This dad figure that, instead of being demanding and saying, you need to be this type of kid, is saying you're perfect the way you are, and learn to just love yourself the way that you are and embrace who you are. And so it's a really fun story, and I love the message of it. And when I think about all of my books, I have just a special place in my heart for Liam as a character. I would love to see more young adult and modern young adult and middle grade literature being used in the schools. I think that there's always been this emphasis on using the classics, which is great. I love the classics. I'm a huge fan of a lot of classic novels. I'm one of those people that still reads them. So it's not anything where I don't like the classics. But I think that the emphasis needs to be on encouraging kids to read and to find the things that they are going to connect to, and that's going to encourage them to read anything, really, that's going to get them excited, that's going to get them passionate. And that's not always going to be the classics. And I'm also a huge fan of giving kids choice. I know that when I was a kid, the minute something was assigned and I had to read it, I hated it, like right from the get-go. But if I had some choice, I usually could find something that then I would really enjoy and I would be interested and excited about. So I'm definitely a fan of using more modern literature because I do feel like it can connect to kids on a different level. And especially these days, I feel like there are so many different versions of books that are coming out, whether it's an ebook or a film. And so it gives teachers and students an opportunity to read books and then also get to experience the other media that they could appear in. I have 2 wily cats who are currently pacing. One of them is currently pacing. I have a husband that I adore, Dustin, and I have a son who is currently 4 years old, Ashton Paul Adams, love of my life. I'm a gushing mom. Motherhood has completely transformed my writing and who I am, and just the way that I write, the subjects that I want to write about. I've been doing a lot more picture books. I actually have, at the moment, I think I have 4 picture books under contract. And, because I'm reading a lot of picture books to him, and when whatever you're reading fills you with inspiration. And so of course I'm involved in the rhythm of picture books and the subjects, and I look at his life and I just get so much inspiration from him. And so he's my biggest inspiration at the moment. And I tend to think now about, I think that as he grows up, I'm sure that inspiration is going to grow and change with him. So a lot of times I think that I'll think, well, what might he be wanting to read in the next year or two?